Every bride dreams of the moment her groom leans in for the first kiss. It is supposed to be the seal of a fairy tale. But for Lady Seraphina, that kiss was the seal of a nightmare. Standing before God and the entirety of London's high society in 1893, the Duke of Blackwood lifted her veil. He looked into her eyes, pressed his lips to hers, and whispered 7 words that would haunt her forever. My heart still belongs to someone else. Who was the woman holding the Duke's heart hostage from beyond the grave? And why did he marry Seraphina if he despised her? This is a story of betrayal, gaslighting, and a dark secret hidden within the walls of Blackwood Hall. This is the story of the unwanted Duchess. The air inside St. George's, Hanover Square was thick enough to choke on. It smelled of beeswax candles, expensive French perfume, and the distinct metallic scent of judgment. Lady Seraphina Sterling stood at the altar, her spine rigid as a steel rod. Her corset was laced so tightly she could barely draw breath, but she refused to faint. Fainting was for women who had options. Seraphina had none. Beside her stood Sebastian Ashcroft, the 9th Duke of Blackwood. He was a man composed of sharp angles and darker rumours. They said he had the wealth of Midas and the temperament of a winter storm. He was tall, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his black mourning coat, and his hair was the colour of a raven's wing, swept back to reveal a face that was devastatingly handsome, yet entirely devoid of warmth. He hadn't looked at her once since she walked down the aisle. Not once. "Do you?" the bishop intoned, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Seraphina hesitated, just for a heartbeat. She looked out at the pews. In the front row, her father, the Earl of Clare, was dabbing sweat from his forehead. He wasn't crying tears of joy. He was crying tears of relief. Sebastian's dowry had just paid off 3 generations of gambling debts. Seraphina wasn't a bride. She was a receipt. "I do," she said, her voice hollow. Sebastian's vow was low, a rumble of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I do. I now pronounce you man and wife," the bishop declared. "You may kiss the bride." The silence that followed was heavy. The congregation leaned forward, a sea of silk and velvet, hungry for a show. The Duke of Blackwood was known for his icy demeanour. Would he break composure? Sebastian turned to her. Up close, he was terrifying. His eyes were a piercing, unnatural shade of grey, like the sea before a shipwreck. He reached out, his gloved hand grasping her chin. His touch was firm, possessive, yet strangely impersonal. He lifted her veil. For a second, Seraphina thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret? Pity? But it vanished instantly, replaced by a wall of indifference. He leaned down. His lips brushed hers, cold, dry, and perfunctory. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of sealing a contract. But then, he didn't pull away immediately. He lingered, his breath warm against her cheek. "My heart still belongs to someone else," he whispered. The words were soft, sharp shards of glass sliding into her ear. Seraphina froze. Her eyes widened, meeting his. He was already pulling back, his face a mask of stone. He offered her his arm, staring straight ahead at the church doors. "Smile, Seraphina," he muttered, loud enough only for her. "The wolves are watching." She took his arm because she had to. She walked down the aisle, forcing the corners of her mouth upward, while inside her world turned to ash. He didn't just not love her. He wanted her to know, specifically and cruelly, that she was a replacement, a placeholder. As they stepped out into the biting London cold and the carriage door slammed shut behind them, The silence between them was deafening. "Who is she?" Serafina asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Sebastian didn't even look at her. He pulled a silver flask from his coat, unscrewed the cap, and took a long swig. "She is none of your concern," he said coldly. "And you would do well to remember that you are the Duchess of Blackwood in name only. Do not expect affection. Do not expect a husband. You have your title and your father has his gold. The transaction is complete." Serafina stared at him, the realization settling in like lead. She was trapped. The journey to Blackwood Hall took 3 days, and for 3 days Sebastian spoke no more than 20 words to her. When the estate finally came into view, Serafina understood why the locals whispered about it. Blackwood Hall was not a home. It was a fortress. Built of dark grey stone that seemed to absorb the light, it sat atop a craggy hill overlooking the moors of Yorkshire. The wind here didn't blow. It howled. They arrived at dusk. A line of servants stood on the steps, shivering in the cold. "Your Grace, Your Grace." The butler, a man named Henderson with a face like a dried apple, bowed low. Sebastian tossed his reins to a stable boy and stormed past the servants without a word of greeting. Serafina was left to descend the carriage alone, her heavy skirts dragging in the mud. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Henderson said to her, though his eyes darted nervously toward the retreating figure of the Duke. "Thank you, Henderson," Serafina said, chin held high. She refused to let them see her crumble. Inside, the house was magnificent, but suffocating. Dark oak paneling, heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the sky, and portraits of ancestors who all seemed to be scowling. "I will show you to your chambers," Henderson said. "And the Duke?" "The Duke resides in the East Wing, Your Grace. You have been prepared in the West Wing. Opposite sides of the house." Of course. Her room was beautiful, filled with French furniture and a roaring fire, but it felt like a prison cell wrapped in silk. That night, Serafina sat at her vanity, brushing her long copper hair, waiting. Part of her, the naive part, thought he might come, that the wedding night might force some semblance of humanity out of him. The clock struck midnight. Then 1, then 2. He never came. The next morning, Serafina decided she would not be a ghost in her own house. She dressed in a gown of deep emerald wool and went down to breakfast. The dining room was vast. Sebastian sat at the far end of a table long enough to seat 30 people. He was reading a newspaper, a cup of black coffee, untouched beside him. "Good morning," Serafina said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. Sebastian didn't lower the paper. "I prefer to dine alone." "And I prefer a husband who acknowledges my existence," she snapped, her temper flaring. She marched to the chair nearest him and sat down. Sebastian slowly lowered the paper. His grey eyes narrowed. "You have spirit. A pity it will be wasted here." "Who is she?" Serafina asked again. She had to know. "The woman who owns your heart, is she a mistress? A lost love?" Sebastian's hand clenched around his coffee cup so hard the china threatened to crack. "If you value your peace, Serafina, you will never ask that question again." "I have no peace," she cried. "I am married to a stranger who hates me. Is she why you brought me to this God-forsaken place? To hide me away while you visit her?" Sebastian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. He leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. "She is dead, Serafina," he roared. The sound was so raw, so filled with agony, that Serafina recoiled. "She is dead, and she is everywhere in this house, and you are a reminder that I am still alive when I should be in the ground beside her." He stormed out of the room, leaving Serafina shaking. "She is dead." The words hung in the air. So she was fighting a ghost. Later that afternoon, Serafina wandered the halls, trying to calm her racing heart. She found herself in a long gallery she hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with landscapes, but at the very end, covered by a heavy velvet curtain, was a large frame. Curiosity, that dangerous thing, took hold of her. She looked around. The hallway was empty. She reached out and pulled the cord. The velvet slid back. It was a portrait of a woman. She was breathtakingly beautiful. Pale skin, hair like spun gold, and eyes of the softest blue. She wore a necklace of blood-red rubies. But it wasn't the beauty that made Serafina gasp. It was the inscription on the brass plaque at the bottom of the frame. Lady Genevieve Ashcroft, 1870-1891, beloved wife. Serafina stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth. Beloved wife? She whispered. Sebastian had been married before. I see you've met Genevieve. The voice came from the shadows. Serafina spun around. Standing there was an older woman, dressed entirely in black crepe, leaning on a cane with a silver handle. Her face was powdered white, her lips painted a severe red. Who are you? Serafina demanded. I am the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, the woman said, limping forward. Sebastian's aunt. Her eyes were sharp and malicious. And you, my dear, are the poor lamb they sent to the slaughter. Beatrice looked up at the portrait of the blonde woman. She was perfection. An angel. Sebastian worshipped the ground she walked on. What happened to her? Serafina asked, her voice barely a whisper. Beatrice turned her gaze to Serafina, a cruel smile playing on her lips. She fell, Beatrice said softly, from the astronomy tower, on a night very much like this one. Some say she slipped. Beatrice stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. But others say she was pushed, and the only person with her on the tower that night was Sebastian. Serafina's blood ran cold. She had married a man who loved a ghost. But worse, she might have married a murderer. For the next 2 weeks, Blackwood Hall felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The silence was absolute. Sebastian was a phantom, disappearing at dawn to ride his stallion, Obsidian, across the moors, and returning only after Serafina had retired to her lonely bed. Serafina, however, was not a woman who surrendered easily. Her father might have sold her, but she refused to be owned. She began to quietly interrogate the staff. Mrs. Higgins, the cook, was tight-lipped. The maid scurried away when she entered a room. It was clear the staff was loyal to the memory of Genevieve, or perhaps they were terrified of the Dowager Beatrice. One Tuesday afternoon, a storm battered the windows, trapping everyone indoors. Serafina sought refuge in the library, a 2-story room filled with the smell of old leather and dust. She climbed the spiral staircase to the upper walkway, running her fingers along the spines of dusty books. She pulled out a volume of Lord Byron's poetry. A romantic cliché, she thought with a sad smile. As she opened it, a piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a letter. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but legible. It was dated August 10th, 1891, 2 weeks before Genevieve's death. Serafina crouched down, her heart hammering against her ribs. She shouldn't read it. It was an invasion of privacy, but she was desperate. My dearest G, the letter began. He suspects nothing. The fool is so blinded by his adoration for you that he doesn't see what is right in front of his face. Meet me at the Folly tonight. We must discuss the plan. Once the heir is secured, we can finally be free of him. Yours eternally, A. Serafina gasped, covering her mouth. Once the heir is secured, Genevieve wasn't the saintly victim Beatrice portrayed. She was having an affair. A. Who was A? And she was planning to pass off another man's child as the Duke's heir. Found something interesting, Duchess? Serafina nearly jumped over the railing. She shoved the letter into her sleeve and spun around. Sebastian was standing at the bottom of the spiral staircase. He looked disheveled. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair wet from the rain. He looked less like a duke and more like a wild animal cornered in his own den. I was just looking for something to read, she stammered, descending the stairs slowly. In the section on agricultural history, Sebastian asked, eyeing the shelf she had been standing near. He walked toward her. The air between them crackled with tension. For the first time, Serafina noticed the dark circles under his eyes. He looked exhausted. "Why do you hate me, Sebastian?" she asked suddenly. She was tired of dancing around the truth. Sebastian stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the wedding. "I don't hate you, Serafina. You ignore me. You tell me your heart belongs to a dead woman. You leave me to rot in this house with your aunt who looks at me like I'm a disease." "I stay away to protect you," he said, his voice rough. "Protect me from what?" "From the curse of being loved by me," he whispered. "Everyone I love, Serafina, ends up destroyed. Genevieve was cheating on you." The words flew out of her mouth before she could stop them. The silence that followed was terrifying. Sebastian's face went rigid. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, deadly rage. "What did you say?" he hissed. Serafina trembled but held her ground. She pulled the letter from her sleeve. "I found this. She was writing to someone named A. She was planning to leave you. She was—" Sebastian snatched the letter from her hand. His eyes scanned the page, and Serafina watched the color drain from his face. She expected him to scream, to tear the paper. Instead, he began to laugh, a dry, humorless sound that chilled her to the bone. "You think I didn't know?" he said, crumpling the letter in his fist. "You think this is news to me? You knew." "I knew she didn't love me," Sebastian said, his voice breaking. "I knew she was cold, but I didn't know about A. I didn't know she was planning to pass off a bastard as my son." He looked at Serafina, his eyes blazing. "You asked who holds my heart. It isn't Genevieve. My heart belongs to the idea of the woman I thought she was. I am mourning a lie, Serafina. And I can't let you in, because if I do, I might find out you are a lie too." He threw the crumpled letter into the fireplace. As the flames consumed the paper, he turned his back on her. "Pack your bags, Serafina. I am sending you to my estate in Cornwall tomorrow. You are not safe here." "I'm not going anywhere," she said stubbornly. "You don't understand," he roared, spinning around. "She died because of me, and if you stay, you will die too." Serafina refused to leave. The next morning, she bribed the stable boy to saddle a horse for her. If Sebastian wouldn't give her answers, she would find them in the village. She rode into the small hamlet of Blackwood. The locals stared at her. It wasn't often the Duchess was seen without an escort. She stopped at the local tavern, the Crow's Nest, ordering a pot of tea just to listen to the gossip. "That's the new one," a barmaid whispered loudly. "Poor thing. Doesn't know the Duke has a temper like the devil. Reckon she'll last longer than the last one?" A man laughed. "Genevieve didn't last 2 years." Serafina sipped her tea, her ears burning. "Excuse me," a smooth voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up. A man was standing by her table. He was strikingly handsome in a flashy, slightly tacky way. He wore a tweed hunting jacket and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Lord Arthur Pembroke, he said, bowing low. At your service. And you must be the breathtaking Lady Seraphina. I am the Duchess of Blackwood, she corrected him coolly. Of course, Arthur smiled, pulling up a chair uninvited. I was a close friend of the late Duchess. Genevieve. A tragedy. A terrible tragedy. Seraphina's mind raced. Arthur. Ah, could this be the man from the letter? Were you close? Seraphina asked, testing him. Very, Arthur said, his eyes darkening. She was unhappy, you know. He mistreated her, kept her locked up in that tower. She used to signal her friends, from the window. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice. People say she fell, but Genevieve was terrified of heights. She would never go near that railing unless she was forced, or unless she was running from someone. He let the implication hang in the air. Sebastian killed her. Why tell me this? Seraphina asked. Because you look like a woman in danger, Arthur said, reaching out to cover her hand with his. His palm was damp. If you ever need a friend, Seraphina, or an escape, I am just across the valley. Seraphina pulled her hand away. I am perfectly safe with my husband, Lord Pembroke. Are you? Arthur sneered. Ask him about the ruby necklace. Ask him why it was never found on her body. Seraphina left the tavern with her heart in her throat. The ruby necklace, the one in the portrait. She returned to Blackwood Hall as the sun was setting. The house felt heavier than usual. She found Sebastian in the drawing room, nursing a scotch. I met Arthur Pembroke today, she announced. Sebastian went still. I told you to stay away from the village. He told me Genevieve was afraid of heights. He implies you pushed her. Sebastian slammed his glass down, shattering it. Arthur Pembroke is a snake. He has been trying to buy my land for years, and he... Sebastian stopped, his jaw clenching. He what? He was the one, Sebastian whispered. I see it now. Ah, Arthur. Sebastian paced the room, running his hands through his hair. If he was her lover, then he knows. Knows what? That night, Sebastian said, his voice trembling. I didn't push her. I wasn't even on the tower when she fell. I was in the library. But when I got there, she was gone, and I saw someone running into the woods. I thought it was a poacher, but it was him. It had to be him. Why didn't you tell the police? Because, Sebastian looked at her, his eyes filled with shame. Because just before she died, we had a fight. A screaming match. The servants heard it. I threatened her. I told her I wished she were dead. If I had told the police about the man in the woods, they would have thought I was making it up to cover my crime. Beatrice told me to stay silent. She provided my alibi. Beatrice? Seraphina frowned. Why would she help you? Because she cares about the family name more than the truth. Just then, a piercing scream echoed through the hall. It came from the west wing. Seraphina's room. Sebastian and Seraphina sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. They burst into Seraphina's bedroom. The room was in chaos. The wardrobe doors were slashed open. Her dresses were torn to ribbons, silk and lace scattered across the floor like confetti. But the most terrifying thing was the mirror. Someone had taken a stick of red lipstick, Seraphina's lipstick, and scrawled across the glass in jagged, violent letters, "Get out or die." Seraphina gasped, clutching Sebastian's arm. Who did this? Sebastian's face was pale. He walked to the window. It was open. The cold wind howled into the room, billowing the curtains. It's starting again, he whispered. What is? The haunting. He turned to her. After Genevieve died, this happened to me. Things moved. whispers in the walls. I thought I was going mad. That's why I moved to the East Wing. I thought it was her ghost seeking revenge. Serafina looked at the lipstick. Ghosts don't use lipstick, Sebastian. This is human. She walked over to the window and looked out. There was a narrow ledge running along the side of the house, connecting the West Wing to the servants' quarters. Someone climbed in, she said. Or someone has a key, Sebastian said darkly. That night, Sebastian refused to let Serafina sleep alone. But he did not touch her. He sat in a chair by the door, a loaded pistol in his lap, watching the hallway. Serafina lay in the bed, watching him. The ice prince was melting, revealing a terrified, broken man beneath. Sebastian, she whispered into the darkness. Go to sleep, Serafina. The words you said at the altar, she said softly. My heart belongs to someone else. You said tonight it belongs to the idea of her. But I don't think that's true. He didn't answer. I think your heart is just broken, she said, and you're afraid to give the pieces to anyone else because you think you'll cut them. Sebastian turned his head. In the moonlight, his expression was unreadable. You are too perceptive for your own good. I can help you, she said. We can find out who is doing this. It's Arthur, isn't it? He wants to drive you mad so you'll sell the estate. Maybe, Sebastian sighed. Or maybe I am mad. Suddenly, a sound came from the hallway. A soft, rhythmic thumping. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Sebastian stood up instantly, raising the pistol. The door handle turned slowly. Serafina held her breath. The door creaked open. Standing there, illuminated by the flickering candle in the hallway, was Beatrice. She looked small and frail in her nightgown, leaning heavily on her cane. Sebastian? She croaked. I heard noises. Is everything all right? Sebastian lowered the gun, exhaling sharply. It's nothing, Aunt Beatrice. Go back to bed. Beatrice's eyes darted to Serafina in the bed, then back to Sebastian. A look of pure venom crossed her face, gone in an instant. Be careful, Sebastian, she warned. The anniversary is approaching. The spirits are restless. She turned and limped away. Thump. Drag. Serafina sat up. Sebastian, there is something wrong with her. She is an old woman, Sebastian dismissed. No, Serafina insisted. She said, the spirits are restless. She wants you to be afraid. Why? The next morning, Serafina decided to investigate the astronomy tower. The site of the death. The door to the tower was locked, but Serafina found a rusty key in a vase in the hallway, almost as if it had been left there for her. She climbed the winding stone stairs. The air grew colder the higher she went. The tower room was circular, with windows on all sides, offering a panoramic view of the moors. In the center of the room was a small table. On it sat a dusty jewelry box. Serafina approached it. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was the ruby necklace. The necklace that Arthur said was missing. The necklace Sebastian thought was stolen, and tucked underneath it was a note. For the new bride. May she fall just as prettily. Serafina grabbed the necklace. She had to show Sebastian. But as she turned to leave, she heard the heavy clank of the iron lock sliding home on the door. She ran to the door and pounded on it. Hello? Is anyone there? Open the door. Silence. Then a smell hit her. Pungent, acrid, smoke. She turned around. Smoke was pouring up through the floorboards. Someone had locked her in, and they were setting the tower on fire. Serafina ran to the window. It was 100-foot drop to the jagged rocks below. She was trapped, and the ghost of Blackwood Hall was about to claim its second victim. The first sign was the smell. It wasn't the cozy scent of a hearth fire or the sharp tang of a candle being snuffed out. It was something acrid, chemical, and old, the smell of centuries-old varnish and dry rot surrendering to heat. Serafina spun toward the heavy oak door. A thin, grey tendril of smoke was curling underneath the frame, moving with a sinister, snake-like intelligence. She rushed forward, her hand slamming against the wood, her fingers grappling for the iron handle. She twisted it. It held fast. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there? Open the door." Silence answered her, followed by a soft, terrifying crackle from beneath the floorboards. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her chest. This was no accident. The key she had found, the open invitation of the tower, the note in the jewelry box. It was a stage, and she was the final act. She pounded on the door with both fists, the dull thuds swallowed by the thick stone walls of the tower. "Help! Fire! Someone help me!" The smoke began to thicken, turning from a wisp into a cloud. It billowed up through the gaps in the floor, dark and oily. It stung her eyes, forcing tears to blur her vision, and coated her throat with the taste of ash. Serafina backed away, coughing violently. The heat was rising, a physical weight pressing against the soles of her shoes. The room was becoming an oven. She was going to die here. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was going to die just as Genevieve had died, another young woman consumed by the darkness of Blackwood Hall. No, the thought screamed through her mind, primal and fierce. I am not a victim. I am Serafina Sterling, and I will not burn for their amusement. She scanned the room wildly. The only other exit was the window. She ran to the casement. It was latched shut, painted over by years of neglect. She clawed at the latch, breaking a nail, but it wouldn't budge. The heat behind her was intensifying. She could hear the roar of the flames now, a hungry, rushing sound, as the fire climbed the wooden staircase, eating the oxygen, racing toward her. She grabbed a heavy iron candelabra from the corner table. With a scream of frustration and terror, she swung it with all her might. Crash! The glass shattered outward, raining down like diamonds into the darkness below. A blast of freezing night wind rushed into the room. It was a mercy, cooling her flushed skin. But it was also a curse. The fresh oxygen fed the fire behind the door. The crackling turned into a roar. Serafina leaned out over the jagged shards of glass in the frame. The drop was dizzying, a sheer vertical fall to the unforgiving cobblestones of the courtyard below. To jump was death. To stay was death. "Help!" she screamed, her voice tearing at her raw throat, carried away by the howling wind. "Sebastian, help me!" She looked down, her eyes scanning the dark grounds. The courtyard was empty. The world was asleep. Then, movement. A figure emerged from the side door of the manor. At first it was just a shadow, but then the moonlight caught the sharp lines of a white shirt. It was Sebastian. He had come outside, likely drawn by the sound of the breaking glass or the smell of smoke. He stopped dead in his tracks. He looked up. Serafina waved her white handkerchief, leaning as far out as she dared. "Sebastian, the tower! I'm trapped!" Even from this height, she saw the change in him. The Duke of Blackwood, usually so composed, so rigid, seemed to shatter. He didn't shout. He didn't waste a second calling for servants. He broke into a sprint. It wasn't the elegant run of a sportsman. It was the desperate, terrifying sprint of a man racing against a nightmare. He disappeared into the archway at the base of the tower. Inside the room, the door began to blacken. The varnish bubbled and blistered. The heat was unbearable now, singing the fine hairs on her arms. Serafina retreated to the farthest corner, huddled beneath the window, clutching the ruby necklace so tight the metal cut into her palm. "Please," she whispered, coughing into her sleeve. "Please hurry." She heard him then. A heavy, rhythmic thudding from the stairwell. He was throwing himself against the door at the bottom of the landing, or perhaps the debris blocking the way. "Serafina!" His voice was muffled, distorted by the roaring fire and the thick oak, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "I'm here!" she screamed back, though it came out as a raspy croak. "The door is locked. I can't open it. Stand back!" he roared. "Get away from the door!" She curled into a ball, shielding her head with her arms. The room was filled with smoke so dense she could barely see her own hands. The floorboards near the threshold began to glow orange. Thud. The door shook. Thud. Wood splintered. The sound was violent, desperate. Crash. With a sound like a gunshot, the heavy oak door exploded inward. Sebastian had kicked it in, the lock shattering under the force of his panic. He stumbled into the room, and for a moment, he looked like a demon rising from hell. He was covered in soot, his shirt torn, his eyes wild and streaming with tears from the smoke. The fire from the staircase licked at his heels, framing him in a halo of deadly light. He scanned the room frantically until his eyes landed on her. "Serafina!" He crossed the flaming threshold in 2 strides, ignoring the fire that snapped at his trousers. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands frantic as they patted her arms, her face checking for burns. "Are you hurt? Can you move?" His voice was wrecked, raw with smoke and terror. "I can move," she choked out. "We have to go. Now, the stairs are burning." He didn't wait for her to stand. He scooped her up into his arms, lifting her high against his chest. Serafina buried her face in his neck, smelling the sweat and the smoke, clinging to him as her only anchor in the chaos. "Hold your breath," he commanded. He turned and ran back into the inferno. The descent was a blur of heat and noise. The spiral staircase acted like a chimney, channeling the heat upward. Sebastian moved with reckless speed, leaping over burning steps, shielding Serafina's body with his own. At one point, a burning beam from the ceiling collapsed, swinging down and grazing Sebastian's shoulder. He grunted in pain, stumbling, but he didn't drop her. He tightened his grip, his jaw clenched so hard, a muscle feathered in his cheek, and he pushed forward. "Almost there," he rasped. "Stay with me, Serafina, stay with me." They burst through the heavy door at the base of the tower and spilled out into the courtyard. The transition from the suffocating heat to the biting winter air was a shock to the system. Sebastian didn't stop until they were well clear of the building, collapsing onto the wet, freezing grass near the fountain. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air, his chest heaving violently. Serafina pushed herself up, coughing, her lungs burning as they greedily sucked in the cold night air. She wiped the soot from her eyes and looked at him. Sebastian lay there, staring up at the smoke-choked sky. His white shirt was ruined, stained black and grey, and blood was seeping through the fabric at his shoulder where the beam had struck him. "Sebastian!" she cried, crawling over to him. "You're hurt!" He sat up sharply, ignoring his injury. He grabbed her face between his soot-stained hands, his grey eyes scanning every inch of her features. The look in his eyes wasn't the cold indifference of the husband she had married. It was a terrifying, consuming intensity. It was the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and barely pulled his life back from the edge. "I thought I was too late," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I saw the smoke. I thought—" He pulled her into him, burying his face in her hair. His embrace was crushing, desperate. He shook against her, the adrenaline leaving his body in tremors. "I'm alive," she soothed him, stroking the back of his head. "I'm here. You saved me." For a long moment, they just held each other, two survivors on the damp grass, while the servants began to shout and run in the distance, finally alerted by the smoke. Sebastian pulled back, his breathing stabilizing. His gaze dropped to her hand. Serafina realized her fist was still clenched tight. She slowly uncurled her fingers. The ruby necklace tumbled out, landing on the frost-covered grass with a soft clink. The red stones glittered in the moonlight, looking disturbingly like drops of fresh blood against the white frost. Sebastian stared at it. The color drained from his face, leaving him ashen beneath the soot. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "It was in the tower," Serafina said, her voice shaking as the adrenaline faded, leaving only the cold truth. "It was in a jewelry box on the table, waiting for me." "That's impossible," Sebastian murmured. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the gems, but not touching them, as if they were cursed. "Beatrice told me. She swore to me she buried this with Genevieve. She said she couldn't bear to look at it, so she put it in the coffin before it was sealed." "She lied," Serafina said, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together in her mind with terrifying clarity. "She lied about the necklace, just like she lied about your alibi to keep you under her control, just like she lied about caring for you." Sebastian looked up at the burning tower. The flames were being doused by the staff now, buckets of water hissing against the stone, but the damage was done. "The key," he said, his voice hardening, losing the tremor of fear and replacing it with something far more dangerous. "The tower has a heavy iron lock. I have the master key on my ring, but there is a spare." "Who has it?" Serafina asked, though she already knew the answer. "Beatrice," Sebastian spat the name out. "She keeps the household keys. She is the only other person who could have locked you in there." He stood up, wincing as his burnt shoulder moved, but he offered her his hand. He pulled her to her feet. The grief and confusion that had plagued him for years seemed to evaporate, burned away by the fire. In its place was a cold, lethal fury. "She killed Genevieve," he said, the realization settling over him. "She pushed her, and tonight she tried to burn you alive to stop you from finding the truth." "But why?" Serafina asked, trembling in the cold. "She's your aunt. She raised you. She claims to protect the family name." "She doesn't protect the family," Sebastian said, darky, turning toward the main house where the lights were flickering on. "She protects the control she has over it. Genevieve threatened that. And you threatened it too." He gripped Serafina's shoulders, looking deep into her eyes. "Serafina, listen to me carefully. I want you to take a horse. Go to the village. Find the constable. Do not stop for anything." "No," Serafina said firmly, grabbing his lapels. "I am not leaving you. Not with her." "She is dangerous, Serafina. She just tried to kill you. And I am your wife," she said, lifting her chin, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood. We do not run. We end this. Together. Tonight." Sebastian looked at her. He saw the soot on her cheek, the terror in her eyes, but also the steel in her spine. He realized then that he hadn't just married a bride. He had married a partner. He nodded once. "Together." He bent down and picked up the ruby necklace, closing his fist around it. "Let's go," he said. "The dowager is waiting." The walk from the burning tower to the main house felt like a march through a dreamscape. The servants were running toward the flames with buckets of water, their shouts chaotic and distant. But Sebastian and Serafina walked in a bubble of terrified silence. They pushed through the heavy oak doors of the main hall. The house was unnervingly quiet. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked rhythmically, oblivious to the violence that had just occurred on its grounds. "She will be in the drawing room," Sebastian said, his voice ragged. "She always sits by the fire at this hour." He gripped the ruby necklace in his good hand, his knuckles white. Blood from the graze on his shoulder had soaked through his shirt, a stark crimson stain against the soot. But he didn't seem to feel the pain. He moved with the singular focus of a predator. They threw the double doors open. The drawing room was warm, bathed in the soft, flickering glow of the hearth. Lady Beatrice sat in her high-backed velvet wing chair, an embroidery hoop in her lap. The needle moved in and out of the fabric with precise, rhythmic stabs. Zip, pull, zip, pull. She didn't look up when the doors slammed against the walls. "Is the excitement over?" she asked, her voice bored, as if asking about the weather. "I heard shouting. I assume the servants have managed to set the kitchen chimney alight again. Incompetent fools." "It's over, Aunt Beatrice," Sebastian said. His voice was low, vibrating with a dangerous tremor. Beatrice paused. She slowly placed her embroidery hoop on the side table. She smoothed her black skirt and turned her head. When her eyes landed on Serafina, standing there alive, breathing, her gown torn and her face smeared with ash, the mask of the grieving dowager didn't just slip. It shattered. For a heartbeat, there was pure, unadulterated loathing in her eyes. It was a look so venomous it made Serafina's blood run cold. "My goodness," Beatrice said, forcing her lips into a tight, grotesque smile. "You look like a chimney sweep, my dear. What on earth happened to you?" Sebastian stepped forward, limping slightly. He raised his hand and opened his fist. The ruby necklace dropped onto the polished mahogany table between them. It landed with a heavy, accusing clatter. Beatrice stared at the jewelry. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She simply looked at it with an expression of mild distaste. "I see," she said softly. "You've been rummaging where you shouldn't. I always said curiosity was a vulgar trait." "You killed her," Sebastian said. "It wasn't a question. You told me she fell. You told me she was clumsy. But you pushed Genevieve off that tower, and tonight you locked Serafina inside it and set it on fire." Beatrice stood up. She didn't reach for her cane. She stood straighter than Serafina had ever seen her, her frailty vanishing like mist. "I did what was necessary to survive," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp and shrill. "Do you think I wanted blood on my hands? I did it for you, Sebastian. I did it for the Ashcroft name." "For me?" Sebastian roared, stepping closer. "You destroyed me. You let me believe for 2 years that I was responsible for her death. You let me think I was mad." "Because you are weak," Beatrice screamed back, spittle flying from her mouth. "Just like your father. You were so blinded by that blonde harlot, you couldn't see what she was." She pointed a shaking finger at the portrait of their ancestors on the wall. "Genevieve was pregnant, Sebastian, and not with your child." The room went deadly silent. Serafina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "She was carrying a bastard," Beatrice hissed, her eyes bulging. "Arthur Pembroke's spawn. She laughed at me, Sebastian. That night in the tower, I confronted her. She told me she would pass the child off as the heir to Blackwood. She said you were too pathetic to ever notice the difference." Beatrice's face twisted into a sneer. "I couldn't let the line be polluted. I couldn't let a Pembroke inherit this house. So I removed the problem." "You murdered her," Serafina whispered, stepping forward to stand beside Sebastian. Beatrice turned her gaze to Serafina. And then he brought you home. Another distraction. Another woman to turn his head away from his duty. I saw the way he looked at you at the altar. I knew it was only a matter of time before you started asking questions. I had to cleanse the house again. You are insane, Serafina said, her voice trembling but firm. I am loyal, Beatrice shrieked. She reached into her knitting basket. Sebastian, watch out, Serafina screamed. Beatrice's hand emerged, not with a ball of yarn, but with a small, pearl-handled pistol. It was an elegant weapon, deadly and precise. She leveled it squarely at Serafina's chest. I missed with the fire. Beatrice smiled, her teeth yellow in the firelight. I won't miss with this. Time seemed to slow down. Serafina saw the tendon in Beatrice's finger tighten on the trigger. She saw the flash of the barrel, but she didn't feel the bullet. Sebastian moved with a speed that defied his injuries. He didn't lunge for the gun. He lunged for Serafina. He stepped directly into the line of fire, throwing his body in front of hers just as the gun went off. Bang! The sound was deafening in the enclosed room, a crack of thunder that rattled the window panes. Sebastian jerked violently back, crashing into Serafina. The force knocked them both to the floor. Sebastian! Serafina shrieked, scrambling out from under him. He was lying on the rug, clutching his side. Blood, fresh, bright red blood, was pouring between his fingers, pooling rapidly on the Persian carpet. Run! He gasped, his teeth gritted in agony. Serafina, run! No. She pressed her hands over his, trying to staunch the flow. She looked up. Beatrice was standing over them, her chest heaving. She cocked the pistol again. The mechanism clicked loudly in the silence. A pity, Beatrice whispered, aiming the gun at Sebastian's head. I really did love you, nephew. But you are just too much trouble to keep alive. Serafina didn't think. She didn't calculate. She acted on pure instinct. She grabbed a heavy brass poker from the fireplace hearth and scrambled to her feet, standing over Sebastian's fallen body. She held the weapon like a sword, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that made even Beatrice pause. You will not touch him, Serafina snarled. She wasn't the trembling bride anymore. She was a lioness defending her mate. You will have to kill me first. Beatrice hesitated. She looked at Serafina, really looked at her, and saw a strength that Genevieve had never possessed. In that split second of hesitation, the heavy double doors behind them burst open again. Police! Drop the weapon! Henderson, the butler, stood in the doorway. Beside him was the village constable and two breathless officers. Henderson, the man who had served the family for 40 years, held a lantern high. He had seen the fire, he had heard the shot, and for the first time in his life, he had chosen justice over loyalty. Beatrice's eyes darted to the police, then to the gun in her hand, and finally to Sebastian bleeding on the floor. The realization hit her. It was over. The reputation she had killed to protect was gone. She would hang, and the Ashcroft name would be dragged through the mud of a murder trial. A twisted, serene smile crossed her face. She straightened her spine. You will never take the Duchess of Blackwood, she whispered. She turned the pistol toward her own heart. Bang! 3 months later. The harsh winds of the Yorkshire winter had finally broken, giving way to a tentative, glorious spring. The purple heather was beginning to bloom across the moors, painting the rugged landscape in strokes of violet and green. Blackwood Hall was different now. The heavy velvet drapes that had choked the windows for decades had been pulled down, replaced by light linens that let the sunlight flood the rooms. The staff moved with a lighter step. The ghost of Genevieve and the terrifying spectre of Beatrice had been exorcised. Serafina sat on a stone bench in the rose garden, a book resting forgotten in her lap. She was watching a man walk across the lawn. Sebastian moved slower than he used to, leaning slightly on a cane, but he looked healthier than he ever had. The haunted hollows beneath his eyes were filled in. The frantic energy was replaced by a quiet calm. He reached the bench and sat down beside her, wincing slightly as his healing ribs adjusted. "The doctor says I can ride Obsidian again next week," he said, a boyish grin touching his lips. "The doctor said you might be able to sit on a horse," Serafina corrected him with a smile. "He didn't say anything about galloping across the moors like a madman." Sebastian laughed. It was a rich, deep sound that Serafina never tired of hearing. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the gold band on her finger. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the birds. "Serafina," Sebastian started, his tone turning serious. He looked down at their joined hands. "There is something I never explained to you, something I said on our wedding day." Serafina's heart skipped a beat. The whisper. "Yes." Sebastian turned to look at her. His grey eyes were clear, reflecting the blue of the sky. "When I kissed you at the altar and whispered, 'My heart still belongs to someone else,' I know you thought I meant Genevieve." "I did," she admitted softly. "I wasn't talking about her," Sebastian said. He squeezed her hand. "I was talking about the boy I used to be. The Sebastian who believed in love, in trust, in goodness. I thought that version of me was dead. I thought my heart was buried in the past, locked away in a time before I knew how cruel the world could be." He looked out over the moors. "I whispered it because I wanted to push you away. I wanted you to hate me. I knew there was a darkness in Blackwood Hall, a rot that destroyed everything it touched. I wanted to scare you off before you were consumed by it." He turned back to her, lifting her hand to his lips. He kissed her knuckles, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I was wrong," he whispered. "The darkness didn't consume you. You walked into the fire and burned it down. You saved me, Serafina. In every way a man can be saved." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "So, if you are wondering who holds my heart now, it isn't the past. It isn't a ghost. It belongs to the woman who faced a loaded gun for me. It belongs to you, completely, until the day I die." Serafina smiled, tears pricking her eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of finally arriving home. "About time, Your Grace," she teased, though her voice wavered. Sebastian smiled. He cupped her face in his hands, tilting her head back. He kissed her. It wasn't like the kiss at the altar, cold, performative, and filled with secrets. This kiss was warm. It was desperate and tender, tasting of sunlight and second chances. It was a promise made not to society, but to each other. The wind blew across the moors, carrying the scent of heather, but the chill was gone. The unwanted Duchess had finally claimed her title, and the Duke of Blackwood had finally found his heart. And so, the haunting of Blackwood Hall was finally laid to rest. Sebastian and Serafina didn't just survive the darkness, they conquered it. It turns out, the someone else holding the Duke's heart was never a ghost. It was his own fear, a fear that only Serafina's courage could break. This story reminds us that sometimes the hardest walls to break down are not the ones made of stone, but the ones we build around ourselves to keep from getting hurt. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It tells YouTube you want more historical mysteries like this one. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. I have a darker, even more twisted Victorian mystery coming next week that you won't want to miss. Did you suspect Aunt Beatrice from the beginning, or did you think it was the lover, Arthur? Let me know your theory in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.